Today we're looking at the story of Solomon. I am John Hartnett, a sort of retired Episcopal priest, and this is the next in a series of reflections I'm doing on lessons appointed in the Episcopal Sunday morning lectionary. Now, Solomon, who figures prominently in culture, people talk about Solomon being wise and Solomon being one of the great kings of Israel. Solomon appears in the lectionary only 3 times, and the lesson we will hear about today is one of them. I'm not going to read the whole lesson because it's kind of long, and I've got a whole story to tell. And in fact, to understand Solomon, we have to look a little bit about the generation before and the generation after. And because of the length of this reflection, and because the subject matter is so extensive, it may feel more like a class than a sermon. That's advance warning. So feel free to pause or to bail or whatever seems right to you as we go through this. And the story begins with King David, whom we heard about, a few weeks ago with David and Bathsheba. And in fact, Solomon, who we're going to hear about today, is the child of David and Bathsheba. Then we heard about how David's son Absalom, many years later, rebelled against David and tried to oust him. And how David narrowly escaped, and how Absalom died in the course of that rebellion, was killed by Joab, David's military commander. And today we hear the story of the end of David's life. David has become old and feeble. He's losing control. The way the Bible tells this story is that he took a new concubine, Abishag, whom he took not because he wanted to have sex with her, because he was too old for that, but just so he could have someone to share his bed with. Abishag shows up in this story later on, so don't forget about her. But the image is David is old. This young, vibrant, powerful warrior, the man who killed Goliath as a boy, who led his nation and established them as a people, has become old and feeble. And that's created something of a power vacuum. David has been reluctant to step aside, but his abilities are significantly compromised by age and weakness. And that's produced an uncertainty and instability and an opportunity for an ambitious person to step up and become the person who's in charge. And that's where David's son Adonijah comes into the story. He is the younger brother of Absalom, and he sets himself up as the heir apparent. He follows what worked for his brother. He gets together chariots and horsemen and a 50-man honor guard and goes around Jerusalem. It's kind of the Bronze Age version of a motorcade. Lots of burly people, this time not with earpieces in their ears, but with sort of military dress on and looking very impressive. Well, that's what Adonijah is doing. Adonijah goes off, and again, he's following the script that Absalom had followed. He leaves town, and he takes with him all of David's other sons, and presumably there are a lot of them, half-brothers. And he also takes Joab, the military commander, the man who had killed Absalom, his brother. And all of them go away, except for Solomon, who's not invited to this party. And it sounds like it's something like a nominating convention for Adonijah. Nathan, the prophet, we heard about him when he came and took David to task for his adultery and murder around his relationship with Bathsheba. Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba herself hear of this plan of Adonijah's, and they quickly go to David. They conspire together and go to David to get David to declare Solomon as his heir and successor. Bathsheba says to David, you promised that our son could follow you as king, and now here Adonijah is claiming that, but you need to step up and finally do something. David agrees, clearly sort of prompted by Nathan and Bathsheba, and Solomon is promptly crowned, and that's followed by a highly public and festive procession through Jerusalem. Nathan and Bathsheba pull this together very quickly, and they are both very effective and very savvy in making this happen. It's another insight into the character of Bathsheba. She's not some innocent victim. She is a smart, calculating, powerful person in her own right. So her son Solomon has been made king. He's been greeted with great acclaim by the people. They are relieved that finally the old man has stepped aside and the new successor is in place, so they can kind of breathe deeply. They've got a younger person on the throne now. Things are looking up. Adonijah, off at his off-site meeting, hears about this. All of the people in the party panic and flee, and Adonijah runs too. They all realize that they could be packaged as being rebels and people who would be guilty of treason, which in those days did not carry a sort of light sentence in sort of a high sort of luxury prison, but at death. So they flee, and Adonijah, realizing that there's a price tag on his head, seeks sanctuary at the altar. Now, there's no temple at this point. That hasn't been built yet. But Adonijah runs to the tent where the altar of God is, and he grabs a hold of the edge of the temple and says, "Spare me! I'm in God's house. Let no violence happen to me here." And Solomon pardons him. The new king says, "I'm king. I've been established," and so Solomon pardons Adonijah. Well, you might think, okay, well, now we're just going to settle in and go ahead about the business. Well, as part of the deal, apparently, for Solomon becoming king, is David gives him a list of scores to settle. Things that David wants taken care of that he doesn't want to do himself. He wants Solomon to do basically his dirty work for him. It's sort of the opposite of pardoning a whole bunch of people at the end of your term. In this case, it's condemning a group of people. The first person on the hit list is a guy named Shimei. He was of the family of King Saul, whom you recall David replaced. And Shimei is the one who had cursed David when David was fleeing Absalom in the rebellion. Shimei stands up on a ridge as David is running away, and Shimei says, "You're getting what you deserve. You're a horrible person. You're a man of blood. May bad things happen to you, and it's about time." David says, "Okay, because of your relationship with Saul, who was my king, I will not take vengeance upon you. I will not hold this against you." David had promised not to punish Shimei, but he didn't promise that his son wouldn't. So one of the things David does is he orders Solomon to kill Shimei. The next person on the hit list is Joab himself, the military commander, the man whom David had trusted on and relied on. But remember, Joab went off with Adonijah. He had backed the wrong faction in this succession fight, and David thought that Joab was just unpredictable. He was too willing to take things into his own hands, and David says, "I want him dealt with." And so Solomon goes after Joab. Joab, like Adonijah, flees to the altar. Hey, it worked for Adonijah. Maybe it'll work for him. He grabs a hold of the altar and says, "I'm in the altar. I'm in the house of the Lord. Don't kill me. I've taken refuge. I've sought sanctuary here." So the man whom Solomon had sent goes back and tells this to Solomon. Solomon's orders are, kill him anyway. Kill him right there. I don't care where he is. I want him dead. And Solomon's deputy goes back and does exactly that. Now, later on, we make a big deal about how Solomon built the temple of the Lord and what a good thing that was. Well, Solomon's respect for the sanctuary of the altar is not evident here. Solomon prioritized what was necessary to be a successful king over what would make him the faithful person of God. We'll see more of this later on. So then we've got Adonijah, the one who had gone off and basically said, "I'm the heir apparent," who'd gone off with all the other brothers and with Joab. He, having been pardoned, makes a quiet sort of approach to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and says, "Bathsheba, would it be okay if I took Abishag, David's last concubine, as my concubine?" Obviously Solomon doesn't want to have anything to do with her. So would it be okay if I had her? And Bathsheba surprisingly innocently, takes this appeal to Solomon, says, your half-brother, you've pardoned him. All he wants is to go off with Abishag. Would that be okay? Solomon says, are you crazy? He said, if I give the king's concubine to Adonijah, who's already claimed that he has a right to succeed his father, if I give the concubine to him, that is in effect giving him the right to be the king's successor. So I can't do that. I can't give him Abishag. The good news is Abishag doesn't fall victim in this plot, but Adonijah does. Solomon says, I want Adonijah dead. So he orders him executed, and he's killed. So at the beginning of Solomon's reign, none of this, by the way, makes it into the lectionary, the lessons that are read in church on Sunday. Before Solomon sort of settles in and begins his reign, he does 3 political murders at David's behest, and one with Adonijah on his own judgment. Solomon sort of clears the deck of his opposition. He gets a new high priest, the high priest who had supported Adonijah. He kicks him out of office, says you supported the losing side, and he makes Zadok his high priest, someone from his circle, and Zadok replaces Abiathar, who had been a supporter of Adonijah. Now, if Zadok the priest starts to sort of ring bells, where have I heard that before? Handel has written a spectacular oratorio about Solomon's crowning, which begins with the text. Actually, it begins with a long, wonderful musical interlude, instrumental interlude, and then it's Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king. If you haven't heard that, boy, it's worth tracking down and just listen to it. It's part of the coronation service of every English monarch, basically since it was written, and it's a wonderful piece of music in its own right. And then the text says, at the end of all these sort of preliminary arrangements, it has this chilling line. It says, Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter. Well, if you've read the Old Testament, your ears should perk up at this point. What is the king in Jerusalem doing marrying Pharaoh's daughter? Pharaoh, not a Jew, Pharaoh imprisoned and enslaved the Jews, making an alliance with his house, suggests also Solomon is putting his faith and his trust in what would be sort of the common political behavior of the day, which is to form a royal alliance with a powerful country. It's not unlike Henry VII in England marrying his eldest son, Arthur, at that point, to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the king and queen of Spain, saying, let's link our kingdoms together. And Solomon seeks to do the same thing with Egypt. Well, Solomon is famous for his wisdom. The text says that Solomon goes to sleep one night, and the Lord appears to him in a dream. And in the dream, the Lord says to Solomon, ask whatever you want and I'll give it to you. It's almost like God as genie, And Solomon says, gosh, what I'd really like is wisdom so that I can rule justly and wisely. And God says, wow, good choice. You could have asked for wealth, you could have asked for power, you could have asked for the lives of your enemies. Instead, you asked for wisdom. Well, I'm going to give you wisdom. And by the way, I'm going to throw in riches and long life too, because you made such a good choice. And then Solomon wakes up. Well, the fact that this is portrayed as a dream gives me just a little bit of pause. Now, God appears in dreams in other stories. I mean, God appears in a dream to Joseph in the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, saying it's okay to take Mary as your wife. So I'm not saying God can't appear in dreams, but as soon as we hear, it's a dream, I wonder how much of this is, Solomon's own projection. Is this really God, or is this just Solomon sort of, letting his own unconscious sort of articulate things? Solomon liked to think of himself as wise. His court propaganda was all about how wise he is. And if you're reading through the story in the first part of the book of 1 Kings in the Old Testament, periodically there'll be these little verses that says, yes, and Solomon was the wisest king in the world and things like that. He liked being wise. Maybe this was a gift of God. But maybe this is just Solomon's, self-image. Who knows? But wisdom is what he's associated with. Everyone thinks Solomon is so wise, and talk about him that way. And we hear a story which is supposed to encapsulate that. And it's the famous story. It's one of the other stories of the three in the lectionary. And it's the story where the two women, and they're described as prostitutes, which, interestingly is described as just sort of like sex workers. I mean, there's no sort of pejorative connotation, it seems, in this account. The thing is, you've got people who do this, you've got people who do that, you've got prostitutes. And anyway, these two prostitutes show up, and they've each recently given birth to a son. Only one of the sons died in the night. And the case has come because they are both claiming ownership of the baby. And the woman who's holding him says, he's mine. And the woman who doesn't have him says, no, it's mine. And she took him when I was sleeping. It's my baby. And they go to the king for the king to make a judgment. Solomon famously says, no problem. You two women, one baby. We'll just cut the baby in half. And you can each have half. And then you can go back and we'll be done. That's simple enough. And then the woman who doesn't have the baby says, oh, no, let her keep him. I don't want anything to happen to this baby. And Solomon says, aha, you must be the real mother. So he takes the baby from the other one, gives him to her, sends him home. And everyone goes, ooh and ah, what a wise judgment. Okay, that's the story. And that's what makes it into the lectionary. I don't think this is the most interesting story about Solomon. And we'll hear more about what might be the real story of Solomon and what we really mean by the impact of his reign on the history of the people of God. Well, the other thing Solomon is famous for, aside from sort of the decision with the babies, is the building of the temple. He built the first temple. You may recall that David had wanted to build a temple and talked to Nathan about it. And after sleeping on it overnight, Nathan came back and said, nope. Not you, let your son build it. Whether that was something that was written down at the time or whether this was a sort of story put back into the text by someone from Solomon's court, who knows? Scholars are divided on this. But there's no controversy at all about the contention that Solomon actually built the temple. Well, he did it by having 30,000 men in forced labor. Not permanent slaves, but people who are basically conscripted, drafted, and told they had to work for nothing. They were done in 10,000 per month rotations. So you'd work every 3 months, you'd be up, and you'd work for a month, quarrying stone and hauling stone and building stuff up. Heavy, heavy manual labor. And it took 7 years for this to happen. Now, another story I've heard about this is that the way Solomon ran this is that each of the 12 tribes, 1 month of the year, all of their men had to come to Jerusalem and work on the building of the temple. It was a huge public undertaking. Think of this as a just overwhelming tax on the people of Israel. And after 7 years, Solomon dedicates the temple. And that's the third story about Solomon that makes it into the lectionary. And it's a wonderful poetic account of what the temple is for and all the various ways it will welcome people and how it will stand for God and God's majesty. And Solomon is there blessing it and basically cutting the ribbon. Now, the story in the lectionary, what we hear on Sunday morning, ends there. What the actual story in the Bible does, it goes on to say God appears to Solomon that night and say, good job, Solomon, in building the temple. And as long as you are faithful to me, and as long as you, see me as your God, things will go well for you and your people. But as soon as you turn aside and start worshiping and acknowledging other gods, things are going to go just the opposite for you. The temple will be destroyed. Your heirs will no longer be the royal family, and the whole city of Jerusalem will be reduced to rubble, and everyone will be either killed or sent off into exile. Be faithful, and you will prosper. Turn aside, and you will be destroyed. And indeed, the temple and Jerusalem was destroyed in 586, so 300 or 400 years after this, perhaps, and destroyed by the Babylonians. And everyone was sent into exile, the ones who survived, and a very few were allowed to remain. But for the most part, the town the city was devastated, and the temple was completely shot. Now, the Bible as we currently have it, the Old Testament. The theory which makes most sense to me, and I think this is commonly accepted, is that it was put into its final form during that exile in Babylon after 586 BC. The idea was they thought, wow, we've lost our homeland, we've lost so many people, all of our monuments are gone, we are going to disappear, so we better write down the story now while there are still people around who can remember it. And so they put together the story. One wonders how much of the Old Testament is really written to try to answer the question, if we're the people, the chosen people of an almighty and powerful God, how is it that we've wound up as slaves and exiles in a foreign land? Where did we go wrong? If you look at the story of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden, it sounds a lot like a sort of a mythical account, a metaphor for what happened to Israel when they were expelled from Jerusalem. They had everything before, and suddenly they had nothing, and they were haunted by death. Before you sort of, roll your eyes and say, well, that's just, sort of Bible language. Imagine if there were a catastrophic nuclear holocaust. Say in the next generation, in North America, and maybe other places in the world, but imagine hundreds of thousands or millions of people being killed in a nuclear exchange. I think the survivors might go back, and when they tell the story of Los Alamos and Einstein, and maybe even the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they might tell it differently, having been on the receiving end of that scientific discovery and that invention of nuclear weapons. Well, that's kind of, I think, what's going on here is the people of Israel have gone into exile, and how could this have happened to us, I think, is what they're asking. Well, God has said, if you are unfaithful, your town will be destroyed, the temple will be destroyed, and it's quite clear that as we hear as the story going on, Solomon starts hanging out with other gods. Now, there are other things about Solomon that make me question whether remembering him as a sort of wise and wonderful king is entirely the principal item of the story here. Solomon, as was the custom of the culture in his day, made slaves of lots of other nations. The Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, just to name a few. And because those are all ancient and biblical names, we sort of say, well, yeah, that's what they did. But, if you said, well, by the way, Solomon enslaved the Syrians, and he enslaved the Palestinians, and he enslaved many of the people in southern Turkey, we might say, well, maybe he isn't someone we should hold in such high regard. So Solomon made slaves. The text goes out of the way, say he never enslaved a Jew. He just used them as forced labor, but not slaves. So there was this clear sense of other people can be slaves, but not my people. Another famous story about Solomon is the Queen of Sheba comes to visit, and she has it's this, again, that's almost a set piece. This royal queen, huge entourage comes, she brings gifts, she hears how wonderful Solomon is, and they have this sort of time together, and then she leaves. It's almost like a freestanding story of how she comes and pays homage to him. And that's where it says, King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Well, he also had 700 princesses, foreign princesses, as wives. 700. And then 300 concubines. So, roughly 1,000 sexual partners. I wonder how many children he had. In a hereditary monarchy, that's got to be an issue that comes up. Think of what it would cost to support the royal family and the royal household, the taxes that would go into maintaining this household, which he did. Does this strike you as being a wise person and an exemplary king? It says Solomon turned away from God at this point. Now, the text tries to blame it on his wives. I mean, they're still trying to protect Solomon's reputation. Say, oh, it was all his foreign wives that lured him away. Well, Solomon could have said no. Solomon goes off and starts making sacrifices to other gods, and he's going with the culture of his age and his region. You can have lots of different gods, and you just go ahead and do what you need to do, because real power is about wealth and buildings and concubines and wives and taxes. That's real power. And we see that the consequence of Solomon's choice is death, destruction, and the disappearance of his kingdom. Well, before that happens, but you get the beginning hints of this. Solomon, as part of his forced labor program, had chosen a man named Jeroboam to lead the forced labor from the tribe of Joseph. Now, Jeroboam is walking along the road one day, and this prophet Ahijah, they all have, weird names, I'm sorry to say, Ahijah comes up to Jeroboam, and Ahijah tears his cloak into 12 pieces and counts them out to Jeroboam. 1, 2, 3, and gives him 10 of the 12 pieces. And he says, Jeroboam, God is going to rip the kingdom from Solomon because of his unfaithfulness, and 10 of the 12 tribes are going to you, and you will be their leader. Well, Jeroboam sees this as a command from God, and so he rebels against Solomon and says, everybody in the north, stick with me, and I will get you out of this horrible, oppressive situation. And Solomon hears about this, and Solomon knows what to do with rebels. He tries to kill him. Solomon seeks Jeroboam's life. Jeroboam flees to Egypt, where you go in that situation, and he hides. He hides out there. It has echoes of David and Saul. When David was anointed king while Saul was still on the throne, Saul got wind of this and tried to kill David, and David went off into hiding. But the clear message was that God's approval and support had shifted from Saul to David. Well, in this instance, it has shifted from Solomon to Jeroboam. Solomon dies, and he's succeeded by his son Rehoboam. Now, we've got Jeroboam, who is the rebel, and Rehoboam, who is the prince. I know it's confusing, but it's what we got. Jeroboam, the rebel, hears that Solomon has died, and he comes back from Egypt and opens negotiations with Rehoboam, the new king, and says, your father's gone, we can make a deal. We can keep our country together the way it's supposed to be. If you lighten the taxes and lighten the load, we can make this work. I would be willing to work with you on that. We don't have to be enemies. Well, Rehoboam, newly on the throne, seeks his advisors' input on this. Rehoboam takes counsel. His old advisors, the older men, say, hey, this is a good deal. You can fix what's broken. We can go forward. You can be king of all the people, not just of your little faction. And that would be a way to bring things back together. The younger advisors, the ones he grew up with, say, are you kidding? You're the king. You can do whatever you want. Are you going to let this old man humiliate you and push you around? You've got an army. You've got the whole structure of the state behind you. This guy's a ragtag rebel who's been hiding out in Egypt. You go ahead, you break him. And then imagine, you think your father was glorious. Imagine the reign that you're going to have instead. People raised in royal palaces have... I guess I want to say a distorted view of the world. Remember, David grew up as a shepherd, okay? Solomon grew up in the palace and had all these extensive taxes and everything to build the glorious temple and the walls of Jerusalem. And then his son, Rehoboam, it's even worse, completely detached from what it is that makes people work. It's a question of, power corrupts, and power by the third generation has corrupted overwhelmingly. Rehoboam hears that Rehoboam defies Jeroboam. Jeroboam rebels, and Rehoboam decides not to fight. He's told if you fight, you're going to lose. And so he kind of pulls in. Jeroboam then successfully leads a succession. And 10 of the 12 tribes pull away. You just heard the horn honking as they were leaving. Well, the tribes of Judah around Jerusalem remain with with Rehoboam. I'm falling over the names. Please excuse me. The tribes of Judah around Jerusalem remain with Rehoboam, the king, and the rest go with Jeroboam, the rebel, and that creates the state of Israel, which is the northern kingdom, versus Judah around Jerusalem, which is the southern kingdom. For the rest of the Old Testament, Israel refers to the north and Judah to the south. To keep people from going to Jerusalem for religious festivals, Jeroboam, up in the north, sets up 2 alternative sanctuaries. He sets up the city of Dan, far in the north, above what is later called the Sea of Galilee, and then Bethel, further in the south, just about 10 miles northwest of Jericho, just north of Jerusalem. And in each sanctuary, you know what he does? He sets up a golden calf as an object of worship. Now, of course, if you know the story of Exodus and the story of the golden calf in the wilderness when Moses is away up the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, and how the golden calf represented idolatry and all the things that were wrong with Israel, the idea that Jeroboam would set up the same thing is a little odd, isn't it? It makes me suspect that whoever wrote the story of Exodus during the time of the exile in Babylon took what Jeroboam had done and put that back into the story of Exodus to say this theme of unfaithfulness and idolatry, which was with us even at the beginning in the wilderness, cropped up again. It's like this constant sort of voice that comes back in a negative way. So I think whoever first thought of this, the idea is the golden calves are a really bad idea. And so Jeroboam, who had God's blessing, just as Solomon had at one point, by virtue of putting up idols, loses all the sort of endorsement from God that he originally had. His son becomes very ill. And so he sends his wife in disguise back to that prophet who ripped off his garment 12 times and sort of gave him the pieces. He sends his wife back to Ahijah, that prophet, and says, find out what's going on. Tell me what's going to happen. Will my son survive? Will we get through this? And Ahijah says to the wife, nope, you're all going to die. Because Jeroboam has turned aside from God. It was God who gave him authority, not his own ability as a sort of radical revolutionary. You've turned aside from that. He has turned aside from that. Everyone's going to die. The northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, are doomed. And in fact, in 722 BC, some centuries after this, the Assyrians come in and wipe them out. Unlike the Babylonian exile, from which there were survivors, the northern kingdom, no survivors. And we talk about the lost tribes of Israel. Those are the 10 tribes who disappeared because Jeroboam did not remain faithful to God, but instead set up golden calves. Well, I think the story here is not about how wise Solomon was, but about his failure. Now, it's easy to get sort of supercilious and high-handed about Solomon, but this strikes me as being more like a Shakespearean tragedy. Solomon had the chance to be a great king, and yet his addiction to being an imperial emperor and a monarch seduced him away from what might be called a way of righteousness and turned him into somebody who just wanted lots of symbols, pomp, wealth, concubines, and foreign wives, and lots. He wanted to be thought of as being wise. The result of that was destruction. Destruction for his family, destruction for his nation. Now, one could say, well, God is just being mean. God doesn't like it when people disobey him, and so God is punishing them, saying you should have done what I told you. Or maybe it's that choosing those things, going with the culture of the day, was a choice which had built within it the seeds of its own destruction.
if you play, realpolitik or power politics, eventually you're going to be crushed by someone stronger than you. The error of Solomon is that he trusts in his own ability, his own wisdom, his own political power, and didn't realize that that was just not going to be enough. Now, I don't think it's, as I say, I'm an outsider in this, not my place to judge. Rather than sort of condescending to Solomon, I would rather see him as someone who had great potential, but alas, made choices which resulted in great destruction. Solomon's failure is that he is deceived by his own sense of power and glory, and by adopting the image of the age as the emperor, and he is the self-proclaimed wise one. That's not the main story. Calling him wise, I think, misses the point. St. Paul, in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians, contrasts the wisdom of God, which he identifies with Jesus and the cross, with the wisdom of the world, the philosophers and the Greeks, the debaters and scholars of the age, the smart people. Paul says the smart people think they're smart, but if you really want to know what wisdom is, look at Jesus, look at the cross, which does not look like wisdom at all. We see this highlighted in Jesus' testimony before his conversation with Pilate in the end of the Gospel of John, when Pilate keeps saying over and over again, I can let you go, just work with me, I can let you go. Don't you know I'm powerful? And Jesus says, actually, no, in this situation, you're not the powerful one. And that makes no sense to Pontius Pilate. But by the time we've read this story, and by the time we think of what Paul has to say, there might be some resonance with that. Solomon falls prey to imperial ambition, a great city built at a cost of long-term social unrest, all that oppressed labor. And all the politically advantageous marriages he made looked good at the time, but it turns out that Egypt is not stronger than God, and the slavery of conquered peoples and a son who knows nothing about how to successfully rule a nation, all these things are elements of instability. One has to ask, gosh, is there a lesson for us in all this? And not just politically and nationally, but even personally. What is it that would make us feel genuinely secure? Is that what we're really putting our attention and energy into? Solomon puts on a good show, but the long-term judgment is that he doesn't deliver. What can we learn from that? Well, it's easy to stand apart, as I've said, and to judge Solomon. But what if this is a case where Nathan comes up and says to me or says to you, you are the man? This is not just a story about somebody else. What if it's a story about you or a story about me? How do we repeat Solomon's error, especially dangerous, when we look powerful, praised, and successful? One of the dangers of being successful is that you start to like it and you want more of it. And Solomon seems to be a sort of a case history in the dangers of pursuing that kind of power. What is the source of long-term strength? What is lasting prosperity? I'm going to jump to the spirit of Richard Hooker, Anglican theologian from the end of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. He died in 1600. And I'm going to argue that in our day, the left gets some things right, if you want to look to political guidance, and the right gets some things right. If you just seek one party or the other, you are aligning yourself with an ideology, not with God. And the point of all these stories is that God can speak through a variety of voices. And if you put something in the place of the voice of God, a party or an ideology or even a culture, then you are investing in something which doesn't have the power to deliver and indeed may undermine you the same way it undermined Saul. Dazzling figures do not offer anything of lasting value. A great city or a great economy founded on exploitation, for example, will be built on a very uncertain foundation. And I think, just to make a little jab here of my own, a schedule of Bible readings, a lectionary, which does not invite us into a consideration of our circumstances informed by God, cuts us off from our principal resource. If all we talk about is, gee, wasn't Solomon wise, we've really missed, I think, the point of this story. Like Solomon, it may look good or even make sense to be wise or educated or powerful or prominent or successful, but does it really deliver? If the church has not prospered in the last 2 generations, perhaps we might ask ourselves why. And then the same for the world. Is the world a better place? Now, maybe I'm just an old man, lamenting an idealized past that never really happened. One has to consider that possibility. Or have we made choices? Have we become successful in America, in this part of the world, become successful and powerful and affluent, and invested in that rather than in those things which actually laid the foundation for all the things we enjoy and take part in now? If the world or the church has followed the path of Solomon, who are we in this story? Well, Jeroboam, the rebel, offers promise, a breakaway, the faction that says we want justice and we're not going to put up with this. Well, that's fine at the beginning, and God initially blesses that and says, yeah, you're right. All this forced labor is not really what I had in mind. But then Jeroboam goes off in just the same wrong direction with the golden calves. Just being a rebel or just resisting unjust power is no guarantee of God's blessing or of success. Are you the prophet in this story? Are you the person who sort of warns what's going to happen? Who might have caused a different outcome? And what would it have taken for Solomon to have repented? I wonder. David seems to have repented at least a little bit when Nathan confronted him about his murder of Uriah the Hittite. I'm not sure the repentance sticks very long, but there was a time when David repented. I wonder what it would take for, us individually, or for people in high office, even within the church, for bishops, for clergy, for rectors, for people in public life, elected officials, for pundits, people whom we turn to and to whom we impute wisdom and power. What would it take for them to say, I was wrong, I made a bad choice, and I need to repent and do things differently? Well, I think Solomon may be a tragic figure, someone who could have been saved, but was determined not to be. I wonder what we might learn from that ourselves. What does it take for us to acknowledge where we've gone wrong, to repent, turn around, and as the baptismal covenant says, repent and return to the Lord, get back to God? I think for me, that's the story of Solomon. And I wish that our readings reinforce that more clearly. But in the meantime, I'm going to try to make up for that absence and invite you to read the story in that way. And the last thing is, of course, if you want to read the story, it's 1 Kings in the Old Testament. About chapters 1 to about 15 or so is the story of Solomon. It's really quite riveting stuff. And I invite you to look at that and ask yourself again, how much of this is applicable to us today, and how much might we learn from it, both privately and publicly? Well, thank you for listening. Long conversation, but an interesting topic, I hope.